This is a 1998 Cadillac Catera, and it was supposed to be a revolution. In the 1990s, Cadillac realized that its buyers were getting, well, old, and they needed something to appeal to young, hip, fresh, new people. That was supposed to be this, the Catera, the Caddy That Zigs, except that it wasn't, really. It failed, and today I'm going to review this car, explain it all, and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Catera is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This has had just one owner in California for its whole life, and it's a great example of the Cadillac Catera, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Cadillac Catera, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Catera, and there are many, starting with the existence of this car itself. There's a lot to talk about with this one, so strap in. Now, back in the 90s, Cadillac's brand was all about old people. Now, you might think that these days Cadillac is still kind of an elderly person brand, but back in the 90s, truly, that's all they had. Their only vehicles were the Fleetwood, a massive sedan only bought by old people. The DeVille, a massive sedan only bought by old people. The Eldorado, a massive coupe only bought by old people. And the Seville, a slightly less massive sedan, but it was still only bought by old people. In the 90s, the average age of a Cadillac buyer was 136 years old. The Catera was an attempt to change that. The idea was they would bring over a smaller, sportier, rear-wheel drive sedan from General Motors' European lineup. They'd bring it to the United States, they'd put Cadillac badges on it, and then it would be sort of a more affordable, cooler, young people alternative to the big old Cadillacs that only old people bought. And so, in 1997, the Opel Omega was rebadged as the Cadillac Catera and brought to the United States as exactly that. It was the largest Opel sedan in Europe, and it became the smallest, sportiest Cadillac sedan here in the United States. Now, of course, they didn't just bring over the Omega and call it a day. In addition to Cadillacifying the exterior, they also made it more luxurious to fit in with Cadillac's brand image, and they made a massive marketing push to demonstrate their appeal to younger buyers. The Catera was named the Caddy That Zigs. Everybody who was alive during this time period interested in cars remembers the ads. It included a duck named Ziggy. The Cadillac logo has ducks in it, but they're very serene, old-school ducks sitting on a pond, perhaps. Ziggy was a bright red duck who was cooler and more fun, and you were supposed to associate Ziggy with the Catera. The marketing push included Cindy Crawford in advertisements for this car. It was all about bringing a whole new buyer into the Cadillac world. So, what did General Motors give us? Under the hood of every Catera was a 3.4-liter V6 with 200 horsepower. Reasonably potent for the time, but it was always mated to a 4-speed automatic transmission. No manual was offered. Now, every Catera was rear-wheel drive, just like the Opel Omega, and they were all built in Germany and made it seem like a sports sedan. With a starting price of around $30,000, the closest competitors were the Lexus ES and GS, the Infiniti i30, the new Audi A4 at the time, the Mercedes C-Class, and directly in its sights, the BMW 3 Series. The only drawback was, although this was the smallest Cadillac, it was still pretty big for a sports sedan, almost 2 feet longer than a 3 Series, and with only a 4-speed auto and only 200 horsepower, well, the Caddy That Zigs, it may have been a bit of an overstatement. But one thing was certain about the Caddy That Zigs. It was incredibly quirky and unusual, particularly to anybody familiar with other General Motors and Cadillac vehicles at the time, since this was never developed as a Cadillac or even by General Motors North America using regular GM switchgear. Everything was totally different, totally unfamiliar, and in some cases, totally weird. We start with the key fob, which looks like a regular GM key fob, as lock, unlock, the trunk, and also a button to open up the fuel door, which actually is a pretty good idea for a key fob. Why don't more cars have that? I don't know that I've ever seen it before, but this car has it. Pretty cool. Next, you open the door, you climb inside, and yes, everything in this car is different. Let's start with the window switches, which are not located on the driver's side door panel like in every other GM car at the time. Instead, they're in the middle, in the center console around the gear selector. These odd switches are the power window switches. They're unlabeled and they have a little light at the bottom, so you always know exactly where they are. Of course, driver is up and to the left. They're all in the relative position of each window. And since we're in this vicinity, let's talk about the shifter itself, which is rather odd. Instead of a button on the side you push to go into gear, there was a little switch kind of underneath that you would lift up and then you would shift into gear. And on the top of the shifter, there was a button marked S, which meant sport mode, which certainly would have been a little unfamiliar to Cadillac buyers in the 1990s. You press the S and a little S with a gear icon shows up on your gauge cluster, which was probably confusing to people back then. Speaking of confusing, another interesting item in here, there's no cup holders. You want them? Too bad. This car was built in Germany. The Europeans, they didn't use cup holders, but they did use cigarettes. And so you have, where cup holders would normally be at the base of the center console, you have a giant ashtray and cigarette lighter. Because Europeans have always made fun of Americans for drinking coffee or soda while we drive, but they got no problems with smoking, and so this car prioritized that over cup holders. Also unusual, the turn signal and wiper stalks you can see here look nothing like any other General Motors car. These sort of horizontal, kind of flat-shaped stalks that are definitely a little bit unusual. And probably the most unusual part is the cruise control function, which operates on the turn signal stalk with these tiny little buttons that require some precision to get exactly right, or else you'll end up turning on the brights or even the turn signals while you're trying to activate your cruise control. I'm sure that would have been frustrating to any old school Cadillac buyer at the time. Also, an unusual thing about these stalks, if you flash the high beams, you can see I'm pulling to flash, then the high beams turn off. Even though I haven't yet released the stalk, I'm still holding it where the high beam flashes, but the high beams have turned off. The car doesn't allow you to just hold the stalk and keep the high beams on. That's for flashing only, and it turns off for you if you don't do it yourself. Anyway, next up, to the left of the steering wheel in that signal stalk, you see a dial that's marked Twilight, and there's an on-off button there. If you turn on Twilight, this will allow the car to keep its headlights on for a certain number of seconds after you turn it off so that you can safely get into your house with some lighting. And this little dial under the word Twilight allows you to adjust exactly how long the headlights stay on for once you turn off the car. Another interesting item in here is the rather large gauge cluster. Instead of being just directly in front of the steering wheel, it kind of moves all the way into the center of the dashboard. And actually, there's some cool design around it, because a gauge cluster that large would be bisected by the rim of the steering wheel, and indeed this one is, but they've engineered a perfectly sized space in the gauge cluster so that the steering wheel doesn't conflict with the look of the gauge cluster. That is a pretty neat idea. But the drawback of having such an unusually massive gauge cluster is that it pushes the climate vents out as well. And so the result is 3 of the 4 climate vents in this interior are basically for the front passenger seat, since even the center climate vents are moved over by the large gauge cluster. The driver only really gets this little climate vent to the left for driver's use. Now, one thing worth noting about this gauge cluster, something I absolutely love, is the warning lights for oil pressure, battery battery voltage and coolant or temperature are actually just the little icons for each of those gauges that light up when it's time to warn people. That's a cool way to integrate a warning light into a gauge cluster, although you may fail to appreciate it when you look down, you see your coolant temperature rising and your coolant warning light has turned on. And next up, another interesting quirk in this car, in the center control stack area, you can see this button turns off traction control. Strangely enough, that is the largest button in the center console area. That's larger than the button to open the trunk, to turn on the heated seat, to turn on the radio, to adjust the climate temperature or the fan speed. The largest button in the center control stack is traction control off, which of course is a button that nobody who bought this car would ever use. Another interesting quirk, over on the driver door panel, you can see this little coin storage holder kind of stuck in place as an afterthought. It clearly doesn't fit in that spot, but they tacked it in there and made it perfectly sized for American coins, because of course the Opel Omega wouldn't have had slots for a dime, a quarter, and a nickel. But here in this car, they wanted to add it in, and so they tacked it in later. Now, next up, we move on to the back of the Catera, and back here it perfectly illustrates one thing I really liked about this car, which was very plush leather seating surfaces. Take a look back here. These seats have barely been sat on, and they just look so leathery and comfortable and creamy, and they do feel very nice to sit in. It's the same deal up front, but those seats have a little more wear. These are just totally plush and basically look brand new. Adding in this upholstery was one of the upgrades they did to the Catera from its lowly Opel Omega status, which wouldn't have been as nice in most trims. Now, as you can imagine, based on what we saw up front, there is some more rather unusual stuff going on back here. Like, for example, you look down at the seat base and you can see there are 4 seatbelt buckles, even though there's only 3 rear seats. The reason for that is the middle seat had to buckle twice. What you would do is you would take the seatbelt from the rear shelf and you would plug it into the first buckle, and then you would go across your chest and plug it into the second buckle, and so the middle passenger had to buckle up twice in order to activate their 3-point seatbelt, which was certainly odd. Also unusual, in the door panels, you can see this little panel cutout here. Open it up, and you have an ashtray. In fact, you have individual ashtrays for rear seat passengers, and you have a cigarette lighter back here, again on the back of the front center console. Now, again, there are no cup holders back here. In fact, there are no cup holders in this entire car, but in back, you have a second cigarette lighter and 2 more ashtrays because, well, this car came from Germany, and that's just what they did. Now, with that said, one nice benefit back here, going back to that center console, you have climate vents, and you have individual heated rear seats, little buttons you can press to turn on the heated rear seats. Both of those things would have been a huge deal back in the mid to late 1990s, especially in this segment of the market. Not too many vehicles like this had rear climate vents and especially rear heated seats, which didn't really catch on for many years later. So this car had some nice luxury touches. But undoubtedly the weirdest and quirkiest thing that's going on in the back seats is the fact that the headrests are not actually mounted on the seats. If you look closely, you can see the headrest is mounted on the rear shelf, not on the seat itself. The seat is designed to be able to fold down and then give you a pass-through from the trunk into the passenger compartment for larger items. And the weird thing about this car is you could fold down the seats without actually removing the headrests if that's what you wanted to do. I'm not sure why they bothered to engineer that. Removing the headrests isn't that big of a deal, but they did, and the headrests are wholly separate from the rear seats in the back of the Cadillac Catera. But anyway, next we move on to the trunk in the Catera. I open it up on the key fob with my handy trunk opener button, and then there's a little lifter back here. You lift up the rather heavy trunk lid, and you get into the trunk, which is fairly large, but otherwise mostly unremarkable, except for the interesting fact that it has this little latch built into the inside of the trunk lid. That latch is to emergency emergency open the trunk from the inside in case someone kidnaps you in their Cadillac Catera. Now, these days, a latch like this is mandated on all new cars with a trunk by the US government, but back in the day, it wasn't, and General Motors just stuck this here, I guess because they thought Catera drivers would be the kind of people who kidnap. Now, the drawback of this particular latch is that it isn't lighted. By law, the latches are all lighted now, but back in the day, they just stuck it there. If you had gotten kidnapped in this car, you never would have been able to see to pull that latch in order to escape. But it was there in case you got kidnapped and you really knew the Catera inside and out. And finally, we move outside the Catera, the gussied-up luxury Opel Omega, to discuss some quirks and features out here, starting with an interesting one with the headlights. When you have the headlights on and you put on the turn signal, a little light lights up kind of on the side of the car to illuminate the path where you might be going, and then it turns off again when you turn off the turn signal. That's called a cornering light, and the theory was it just made it a little bit more illuminated in the direction of your travel. Now, another interesting lighting element up front, when you put on the turn signal, the main bulb would switch off blinking with another turn signal bulb that was located in the reflector on the side of the car. And you can see one blinks, it turns off, then the other one blinks, and they just switch off back and forth. Now, that's not all that uncommon, but one weird thing about the Catera is it did the same thing in back. You put on the turn signal and the rear main turn signal light switches off with a turn signal light in the side reflector back here. I've seen a lot of cars that do this in front, but I don't think I've ever seen another one that does it in back. It is certainly a bit of an interesting Cadillac Catera specific item. Now, speaking of lighting, and worth pointing out in back, you have this large light bar that goes across the entire trunk of the car. It gave it sort of a classy upscale look befitting a Cadillac of its era. But you will notice back here, you do not see the typical Cadillac reef and crest emblem. Instead, they've spelled out Cadillac across the back. They wanted to ditch the old school and embrace the new wave of young Cadillac buyers. So, you might be wondering, what happened? What happened with the Catera? Based on the title of this video, you're probably guessing that it didn't really meet Cadillac's sales targets, but that's not entirely true. This car was relatively successful. It didn't require much engineering since they were already building it, and they managed to sell almost 100,000 of these in North America. The problem wasn't the sales numbers, it was who they were selling it to. Guess what? It didn't reach the young people. It was the same old folks who were buying other Cadillac models, just saw a smaller one at the dealership and decided to buy that instead. They didn't really get that young, hip, fresh-faced buyer coming out of BMW. But the Catera did pave the way for the beginning of that process. This car's last year was 2001, and in 2003, Cadillac replaced it with the CTS, which occupied the same market segment, but with more aggressive styling, sportier driving experience, more power, and it finally did start to resonate with those younger buyers in concert with the Escalade that was also gaining popularity at the time. Those cars really did have an effect of making Cadillac kind of move away from the very, very old segment of the population they were catering to before, and these days, although the Cadillac buyer is still relatively old, they're not the elderly geriatrics that they were back in the mid-90s, and one could argue that movement began with this car, even though this car itself wasn't a huge success at getting them there. But you might be curious, how does it drive? What's it like behind the wheel of Cadillac's early effort at appealing to the youth? Let's find out. All right, driving the Cadillac Catera, the Caddy That Zigs. This is a very interesting experience for me. I was 10 years old when this car was announced, and it's hard to really explain to modern people how much of an old person brand Cadillac really was. It's funny because today Cadillac still has kind of an image of an old person brand. The Escalade has obviously changed things a lot. But in the 90s, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, old people buy Cadillacs. That was all. That was it. Literally, I mean, it was an 80+ crowd buying these cars exclusively. And when you have a brand, that's not great for continued development and growth of the brand, right? These people are going to die off, and then you're not going to have anybody left. And so This car was a huge deal. Cadillac now releases a car, kind of a younger car like an ATS. It doesn't get as much coverage, but this car was a huge deal at the time of Cadillac kind of trying something new and trying to go into a different segment that it hadn't really been in since the Cimarron in the 80s, which was an abject disaster. So the first thing when you get inside this car, I mean, like I mentioned in the quirks and features portion, this is a totally different experience than any other Cadillac. Nothing in here feels familiar to other General Motors cars from this era. Obviously, that's because it was developed in Europe for European buyers. It was not co-developed with any sort of North American Cadillac. And so it's just totally foreign, literally and figuratively. It just feels very foreign in here. Now, just a few minutes behind the wheel of this, I can tell already why it's very clear why this car was not really a big hit with the younger buyers that Cadillac was looking for. Yes, this was a different car for Cadillac. It was sort of a rear-wheel drive, smaller car, which the Seville was supposed to be when it came out in '93, but it was still too big, and it was front-wheel drive, and it was just deeply old people car. This was going even smaller, going rear-wheel drive, going sporty, but it doesn't really succeed at doing any of that. It's not a particularly sporty car. It's not a particularly fast car, and it still feels sort of like a staid, stoic kind of, I don't want to say old person car because it wasn't really, like it did kind of reach a new segment, but it didn't really reach that many people in the new segment because it really wasn't like a BMW 3 Series alternative. For Cadillac, it was a very sporty car, Cadillac at the time. But for the buyer base as a whole, for automobilia, we looked at this car and we thought, 200 horsepower, automatic only, and it was still big. In fact, this car was so big that the next generation, the CTS, when they finally really got serious about a sportier sedan, was actually smaller than the car that it replaced, which is very unusual, and it was especially unusual back in the 90s. But they really wanted to tighten things up. And this was Cadillac attempting to do that, but it just really didn't. Now, again, I gotta put this in context because it's really important to explain. This car is way sportier than Cadillac models were at the time. It is sportier on a degree that is hard to even fathom or explain compared to Cadillac models at the time. Again, an improvement for Cadillac, but you know, if Cadillac is here in the world of sporty and BMW is here, this car brought Cadillac to here, but you weren't gonna get those young buyers who were buying BMWs with a car like this. I will say driving this car is a nice experience. Like, it feels nice in here. It feels luxurious. This particular one is in shockingly good condition. Very little wear in this interior. It's reasonably quiet in here. It's generally a nice place to be, honestly. But unfortunately, that was kind of part of the problem. It was a little bit more Cadillac luxury than it was, you know, sports sedan young people. And it is worth pointing out, this V6, this is a smooth engine. You know, it does what you want it to do, but it's not really eager or excited to get up and go, and the transmission doesn't help. The transmission is comfortable. It shifts very smoothly. Even, you know, still this car is 20 years old, it shifts very nicely, but you don't get the high performance anything when you're driving this car. Driving it now, it's hard to believe they pitched this as the Caddy That Zigs. It doesn't zig all that much, but it does okay. And it certainly does better than other Cadillac models at the time. And it's very interesting to see this European car brought here, made as a Cadillac, and it feels totally different from all of the other Cadillac models and General Motors vehicles in the era. And so that's the Cadillac Catera, the Caddy That Zigs, the rebirth of a new Cadillac that never birthed. It's interesting to review this car and see how Cadillac tried to solve its old people problem in the 1990s, and now it's time to give the Catera a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 40 out of 100, which puts the Catera here against some sort of similar cars. At the bottom, but most of these cars aren't close rivals to the Catera, as I don't really test many cars like this. The Catera is sorta cool, but mostly a nice reminder of the time Cadillac decided to start appealing to younger people, the beginning of a very long journey that's still ongoing.